Greetings, everybody. Welcome to the lecture, for lack of a better term, for week 6 and 7. Uh, Week 6, we are completing the poetry paper that we started in the previous module. And in week 7, you're going to be choosing either the poetry paper or the previous one, the fiction paper, to do a complete revise of based on your previous grade and my comments and my feedback. And that's going to be submitted for a new paper grade. So you'll notice that it is called the Common Assessment for ENC 1102. That is what the school uses for assessment purposes. So all of the ENC 1102 students across the college have that paper in common. Now, they're not the same paper for all the classes. We individual instructors have the ability to say, this is the one we want to use for that common assessment. So for you guys, we're going to be taking a paper that you've already submitted, that you've already received grade and feedback on, and you're going to be revising it. So this will give you the chance to really shine in the common assessment for the college. So let's take a look at what's happening in this particular module. I've got just a couple of slides to remind us what we need to cover, and then we're going to go more into the class, kind of like we typically do on weekly walkthrough videos. But so like I said, this 2-week period, you're going to be working on the poetry paper, finishing that up, getting it back eventually, and then doing the common assessment. Now, typically, I'm going to get those grades back as soon as I possibly can on the poetry paper because I know the very next week you're going to be working on the common assessment. If something happens and we need more time, I'll make that happen. But for right now, assume that during week 6, you're going to be submitting the poetry paper, and during week 7, you're going to be doing your revisions and submitting the common assessment. So as far as what we want to go over right now, I'm going to review the 2 assignments so that you have reminders of what they are. We're going to talk about the poetry paper itself and how to incorporate a poem into a paper, choosing for key phrases, choosing the quotations. How do you put quotations for a poetry paper in the poetry paper? How do you integrate the research? Because of course it is required as well. And then we're going to take a quick look at where to find and access the revision information that you need. So the feedback that you got from me, as well as the grade, of course, and looking at the rubric to determine where, what areas you should tackle most for the revision. Okay. So let's open the course, and I'm going to turn this on in student view because we're going to need that in a moment, because we're going to look at that grading feedback towards the end here. But before we do that, let's go ahead and review the 2 assignments. So in the modules, of course, we can access all of our assignments. Oh, except we can't access that one because it is not turned on. Let me get out of the student view for that purpose. That's my bad. All right, so poetry paper. So let's look at the poetry paper first. Remember that for the poetry paper, you're going to be choosing 1 or 2 poems at the most from our selections of poetry. In the LibGuide reminder that the poetry section, you have quite a few things that you can choose. Maya Angelou's Phenomenal Woman, Louise Bogan's Medusa, County Cullen, Yet Do I Marvel, Robert Frost, Acquainted with the Night, Robert Herrick, To the Virgins to Make Much of Time, Langston Hughes, Theme for English B, John Keats, To Autumn, William Shakespeare's Sonnet 130, which is My Mistress Eyes Are Nothing Like the Sun, or I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud by William Wordsworth. In all of these cases, you have access to secondary sources through the LibGuide. So you may or may not end up doing additional research, but keep in mind that the best sources that you can use are always going to be those that are already provided for you. So when we get to talking about the research, I'll remind you about that again. But remember, this is where you would find all of that information. So in our LibGuide, which of course you can access from the homepage, from various places throughout the course, click on poetry, and that will take you to the ones that we are focused on. We will also, excuse me, have already turned in the preliminary bibliography previous to these 2 weeks. So you should also have some feedback on that and any sources that might, be problematic or might be great. So you'll have that access as well. You're essentially doing what we call a close reading, but you're also incorporating research. So you are the primary person who's going to interpret this poem, and you're going to focus on the formal elements of poetry that we've talked about before: theme, speaker and tone, diction and word choice, imagery and symbolism, any sound devices like rhyme schemes, if there are some, that sort of thing, structure and form. We've got a couple of poems that are specifically sonnets. So of course, if it's a very form heavy poem like a sonnet, you would want to focus on that. If it's not, then you probably don't need to talk about that. Figurative language, so things like metaphors, similes, personification, all those fun things. And of course, you can also incorporate the historical or cultural context if it's relevant to understanding the poem. In some cases, the poem, if it's a love poem, you probably don't need to know the historical background, but some poems, of course, will have more importance in terms of what's going on in the world at that time. So anyway, it's up to you. You are going to be using some secondary sources. And like I said, the number one place to look for those is going to be in the LibGuide, because there are some provided for all of the poems that we have been assigned. You guys have been assigned. You're mostly looking for academic sources such as peer-reviewed literary criticism, scholarly books or essays, and articles from the big databases that we look at a lot in the library. You must have at least 3 sources. I have said here to avoid sites like SparkNotes or Schmoop or Wikipedia. Those are great for background information and for generating ideas about what to write about with the poems, but they probably are not something that you will want to or need to cite. Now, there are some exceptions to that. SparkNotes, for example, has some really good analysis of poems. And even though it's a kind of overview site, if there is something that you learned through SparkNotes or even Wikipedia that you need to incorporate in your paper, do go ahead and cite it. But I would not rely heavily on those kinds of sources, and I would definitely not count that as one of my at least 3s. So if you have some supplemental information from other websites and things like that, that's absolutely fine. But the bulk of the paper should be based on academic sources. In terms of organization, you'll have an introduction, body paragraphs, and conclusion, of course. You are going to need to include both in-text citations for the poem or poems and any sources that you've used. When you're citing poetry, it's important to remember that you use line numbers in the in-text citations as opposed to page numbers or anything like that. Works cited, of course, is going to be MLA, Times New Roman 12 point, the whole thing, or whatever your default is. As long as the whole thing is the same font and size and it's a standard font and a standard size, that's absolutely fine. The header in an MLA paper, of course, has your last name and page number. And then in the top of the first page, which we would call a heading, name, my name, course, and the date. So you've got samples of those. You've got the library materials to help you with that. This paper will end up being at least 3 full pages. That does not ever include a works cited. And we've got some helpful resources here that you can work with as well. You do, of course, have a rubric that will remind you of how your grade is determined and will also serve you when you go to revise this paper or the fiction paper, because you'll want to target the areas that maybe you didn't score as highly on. So that is your assignment for the poetry paper. In the module itself, and I will access this now. It's not published yet, but it will be by the time you're seeing this video. You have access to the sample poetry paper. So I'm going to go ahead and open that. This could be a good thing to use as a template if you wanted to use my template instead of the library's template. Make sure, of course, that you change everything that needs to be changed, but this is a real, this is a paper that looks exactly like the kind of paper we're going to write. This particular one is about I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, which of course is one of our choices. And you will notice that it does preview. That's not really the word I want. Give you samples. It's not really the phrase I'm looking for, but it'll do. It shows you examples, there we go, of citations and quotations from the poetry. So I want to point out a couple of things with the poem here. First of all, the very first poem quote says wandering lonely as a cloud, and that is from line 1. So Wordsworth, line 1, is the in-text citation for that. Again, it has the author because the author wasn't named, and it has the line number because that's how we cite poems. The next quotation is 2 lines, actually 3 lines long, and you'll notice that because it is not 4 or more, it's not using a indented format, the block format. You would just include it in the text with the quotation marks, but it has the slant lines to show where the line breaks are. And then in the poem, we already know who wrote it because we're talking about it. Now we just have lines 4 to 6. We also have in that paragraph some secondary research. Frederick A. Pottle suggests blah, 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 blah. We've got a page number for Pottle's source because it was a PDF. We've got some quotes from it. There you go. Okay. When you are, and this is what I wanted to talk about with the incorporation, when you are writing about poetry, you don't want to just write everything that you want to say and then have the citations for secondary material at the end. Wherever you can, you want to include both the poem itself and some secondary research in the same paragraphs. Now, not every paragraph has to have both, but you'll find that that's a really good way to do it. So for each of the little sections, you'll notice that after the quote from the poem, we have some research to back up the interpretation that we're doing. So you'll see that kind of throughout this particular paper. And then, of course, we have the sample works cited page that has alphabetical order. It has hanging indent. It has all the things that you need, including, and this is one a lot of people forget, the poem itself. The poem itself does have to be on your works cited page, and it does have to be cited within the paper. So take a look at this. This should help you. You can download it if you want to, in order to use this as a template. You may want to do that, or you may already have one saved that you want to use. But this will give you some good reminders about what it should look like and what it means to incorporate both the poem as well as secondary research. Remember, the poem should be quoted often. You want the literature to itself to take center stage. With the secondary material, you want to paraphrase as much as you possibly can. usually, there's usually some quotations from the secondary sources as well, but whenever possible, you want to put that in your own words, but you still give them credit. The other thing that I wanted to remind you of is the incorporation includes not having a quotation just sitting in anywhere by itself. So for example, this is from Warren. So instead of just plopping the quotation in there, you do have the phrase that says she writes. You always want to have things attached to something else. And in some cases, it's just the previous sentence. So in this one, for example, in the poem's final stanza, Wordsworth reflects on the power of memory. And because that is a full sentence, we have a colon instead of a comma, and then we have the quotation. Okay. This quotation, for example, by the way, and I didn't do it, and that's on me. This is 4 lines, so this could be an indented quote. If you need some help with that, let me know. Certainly, if it's more than 4 lines, you want to use the block formation, which is the 1-inch indent on the left-hand side. And I can help you get that set up if you need some help with it. Okay. So with that being said, let's talk about the revision and feedback piece, because you're going to be turning in your common assessment as well. Okay. So first, let's look at the assignment for the common assessment to remind you of what it is that you need to do. And then we're going to turn on the student view so that we can look and see what the feedback was on the previous papers. All right. After receiving both a grade and instructor feedback on the previous papers for this course, and that would be both the fiction and the poetry papers, learners will use the feedback to revise one of these papers, you get to pick, for a new grade. Now, I don't care which one you pick. It doesn't really matter if you pick the one that needs the most help or the one that needs the least help. It's going to be graded using the common assessment rubric, which is different from the paper rubric. So these are the criteria that this one is going to be graded on. So make sure that you check that out as you do it. It still also must meet all of the original requirements. So it does need to be on a story or a poem in our selections. It does need to still have the research incorporated and all of those things. Changes are mostly going to be based on the feedback received. Okay, so this new paper is not going to change the grade on the initial assignment, but you are getting a new score out of 100. Okay, and I know it's 104, but that's because of the extra assessment pieces that you don't need to worry about. It's for the school to track accomplishment, and those accomplishment scores, those assessment scores, are not tied to you as an individual. They are tied to the course as a whole. So don't worry if you didn't get all perfect scores on them. It's really okay. Nothing bad is going to happen to you. I always like to remind people of that, because it can be overwhelming if you see, oh gosh, I didn't get this point. What did I do wrong? Don't worry about it. It is truly just a statistical thing that the school looks at. Okay, so let's look at the grades. I have done a little kind of fake grade for the fiction paper just so that I can show you and remind you where to find the feedback. So you would go to your grades and you will see whenever, of course, there is something graded, you will have the scores and you will have these little dots that show you haven't looked at something yet. This one, of course, is for the score overall. This is for the feedback or the rubric, and this is for the comments. Now, I prefer, when I'm showing you how to access your feedback, that you just click on the name, because that's going to show you everything that you need to see. So you've got view feedback. This is where it's going to give you that preview window. And if I've made any comments in the window itself, those will show up here. You can see where those are annotated. You will also be able to look at the rubric. And the rubric, of course, like I said, when you're doing your revision, you're probably going to want to target areas that you didn't get a perfect score on, because, of course, that will give you some places to change it. The other thing that you want to be able to access will be my feedback. Oh, here we go. So there are three different ways that you might see feedback. Either there's going to be text typed in the box. Most of these papers, there will be video feedback where I will walk through the paper with you and talk about changes that you could make and things of that nature. And then, of course, I already mentioned those notes in the preview window. So you want to look for any feedback that you have available, and that's what you're going to base your revisions on for the common assessment. So again, just keep in mind, you do not have to worry about the original paper. You don't need to turn it in again. You're going to only turn this new version into the common assessment. Okay, so if you have any questions about that, let me know. But that is our main set of excitement for this 2 week period in our modules. So if you need any help, please do not hesitate to reach out. Remember, of course, you also can take that paper to the Learning Center, to the library, to get some extra help from people other than me. If you want second and third opinions, you can do that as well. So hopefully this is helpful. And if you've got any questions about it, you guys know where to find me by now. So everybody take care, and we will be back for more fun and excitement in the next module.